Hey everybody, this is Aubrey Chavez from Faith Matters. Before we get started, we wanted to invite you to give us some feedback. It's exciting for us to see the growing community of listeners and readers that have embraced what we do at Faith Matters. And so we have two questions for you. First, we want to know how Faith Matters through our podcasts, books, courses, etc. has affected your life. And second, we want to know which topics or questions you would like us to engage more deeply. So we invite you to go to faithmatters.org/feedback and briefly give us your thoughts on those two questions. We really value this feedback. Again, go to faithmatters.org/feedback. Today's episode is with Dr. Lisa Olsen Tait, one of the general editors of the new third volume of Saints, the story of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was published this week by the Church. The publication of this volume follows the first volume, published in 2018, and the second, published in 2020. Many of you may be familiar with the Saints Project. It's gained widespread popularity because of its accessibility. It's written in a narrative format, as well as its strict adherence to documented history. We were able to ask Lisa about this process in detail, and we're fascinated and impressed with how this huge endeavor came together. We know that many Latter-day Saints have had a complicated relationship with church history. It can be alternatingly inspiring, confusing, uplifting, and disturbing. And as Lisa put it, there's a history to the church's relationship with its history. For those who have longed for an official story that is more open and accurate than anything the church has produced before, it seems to us that Saints is a huge step in the right direction. This volume of Saints is titled Boldly, Nobly, and Independent and covers the time period between 1893 to 1955. It's a really fascinating period, one in which the church underwent extensive transformation. In many ways, it's when the church transformed from the pioneer church into the beginnings of the church we'd recognize today. The digital version of this volume of Saints is available for free on the church website and in the church history section of the Gospel Library app. Print copies will be available in the coming weeks in the church's online store and at retail outlets. To give you just a little bit more about our guest, Lisa Olsen Tait, she's a historian manager, writer, and specialist in women's history at the Church History Department. As we mentioned, she's a general editor on the Saints series, and on Volume 3 contributed subject matter expertise in the late 19th and early 20th century, and on many aspects of women's history. She is also a co-chair of the Mormon Women's History Initiative team, an independent group that fosters scholarship and networking in the field. Lisa earned a PhD from the University of Houston, studying American literature and women's studies, and she taught religion classes at BYU Provo for 3 years before joining the Church History Department in 2013. Thanks so much, as always, for listening. We really hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as we did. Dr. Lisa Olsen Tait, we're so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk about the third volume of Saints, which is really exciting. We love this book, mostly I think because this is history that is so unfamiliar. It's sort of like this moment in time where the church becomes itself, like becomes the church that we're really familiar with. So many interesting things to talk about. But I'd love to just start, if you could just tell us a little bit about the Saints Project broadly, and what is the intention for the project and how did it come to be? And I'd love to hear kind of like the scope of the whole thing and what the purpose really was.
Okay. Well, the idea for Saints actually goes back 25 or more years to the 1990s. It's kind of the brainchild of Rick Turley, who you may or may not know. Rick was the managing director of the Church History Department, assistant church historian for many, many years. And he kind of had this idea that we needed a new history of the church. I'll say more about that in a minute. And that it should be told from the perspective of the saints. And so that's where the title comes from. The idea that this story is going to be told through the eyes and through the experience of people rather than as just a top-down institutional narrative. The project, as it has come into being, was approved by the first presidency in 2010.
Oh, wow.
And so work on this project, I joined the department in 2013, and work on the project was already happening at that time. And part of Rick's vision for it was that it should be the best historical scholarship with literary writing, novelistic writing. He likes Michener, James Michener, and he's kind of thinking of that as a model. And so the idea is to bring those together to make it readable, to make it accessible, and especially to be appealing to what's called the rising generation in section 69 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is a revelation to John Whitmer, who was an early historian, a revelation of John Whitmer, who was serving as the church historian at the time, and speaks specifically of the purpose of keeping the history in the church is for the benefit of the rising generation. And so that was all well and good. A great theory, great vision. The department brought on some really great historians to work on the project, some writers. They got to work, did a lot of drafting and research, wrote drafts of all or part of some of the volumes. And then it was probably a couple of years after I joined the department, 2015, 2016 or so. Those volumes kind of got their first look, and a bunch of us read them and reviewed them. And it wasn't working.
Really?
The problem is that if you want literary writing, you've got to bring in literary writers. And so this project then kind of shifted approach a little bit. And we brought in people with, PhDs in creative writing. So novelists, playwrights, poets, people who know how to tell a story and how to turn a phrase and how to look for the drama and the character and so forth. As well as, we still have the team of historians doing the really rigorous research. But bringing the literary writers and the historians together is what's given us the product that we have.
That really is what struck me. I mean, it's a serious book, but it doesn't read like a textbook. It really does read like a novel. But I can hear like a critic saying, whoa, did she just say they brought in creative writers to write Saints? So talk about like, how did you stay anchored to the history?
Right. Well, in the back of these huge books, you'll find a note on sources that explains that every detail, every fact in these books is based on a source. Like it's based on
facial
historical
expression, dialogue.
If it says what the weather was, if it says dialogue, if it says a facial expression, that's found in a source or reasonably inferred from a source. And one of the really demanding aspects of this project is what we call source checking. So the historians do a bunch of research, the writers read and draft the scenes, they get reviewed multiple times, and then it goes to the source checkers. And they literally go through every source, every detail, and they come back to us and they say, the source doesn't say this. You can't say that. So people can have confidence that while these books are literary, they are not fictional. Not in any sense. And I mean, believe me, like poets and playwrights, they would love to be able to like make up a little bit, give us something to work with here in terms of emotion and details. But that's one of the anchoring imperatives of the project is that it has to be factual.
So I'm sure, as you're well aware, there's been lots of criticism over, many decades about the church's sort of official historical efforts. And the criticism is that either much of what's been published has been either too simplistic or in some cases maybe even bordering on not quite true. To what extent, and I've heard a narrative that the Saints Project, and I don't know if this is true at all, is in some ways a response to that criticism, to like get something out there that is true, historical work that is, sourced as credibly as you're laying out. Is that part of it? Like, is Saints a response in some ways?
Yeah, I don't know if you would say that was the original idea or the original imperative behind it, but definitely over the last 10, 15 years particularly, we've become aware, right, that we live in the Google age.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that you just have to have a different kind of history. You have to have a different kind of relationship with information than, what was the case in the past. Saints is definitely part of what I'm sure you recognize as a larger pattern on the part of the church history department. The Joseph Smith papers, the gospel topics essays, revelations in context even. I mean, a lot of things that we have published, first 50 years of Relief Society, have been an effort to really get the most rigorous scholarship out there, in a lot of cases based on access to sources or ways of approaching sources that didn't exist in the past.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think the church's relationship to history there's a history to that.
Yes.
There's a history to the way that the church has thought about and used its own history. And so we can do another podcast about that sometime.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a recognition that the ways that we have told history and thought about history in the past are not adequate anymore.
Right.
Which to a great extent is true on a larger scale as well. I mean, think about the reckoning that the United States is having with the histories we've inherited of the founding fathers and this Constitution and things like that. So there's a bigger pattern going on there as well, with just shifting sensibilities about history and what history should do.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah. And then I will add as well that the last time the church published an official multi-volume history was in 1930. It was B.H. Roberts' Comprehensive History of the Church, which was published in conjunction with the church's centennial. And so, I mean, that's almost 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And there
incredible.
Was definitely a need for that to be updated.
How much, this is just sort of a meta question, but how much have our access to sources multiplied in the 100 years since that was published?
Yeah, a lot for sure. Especially, again, this is one of the ways that thinking about history has changed, like what counts as history.
Right.
You know, B.H. Roberts is writing from this, magisterial tradition of great men and institutional history, and that's what history is. And now, I mean, Saints is exhibit number 1, right? History is people and their experiences. It's women, it's people of color, it's people that were on the margins as well as people that are at the center. And so expansion to sources has increased along with our sense of what counts as a historical source.
Wow.
And what kind of historical stories we want to tell.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I want to know how, it says Saints itself says it's not meant to be a comprehensive history.
Yeah.
Even though it's so extensive, I'm so curious about how you decide what makes the cut. In that case where that you're not going to be able to cover everything, do you always lean faith promoting? Or how do you what did you have some sort of guide for deciding what needs to be in the book?
Yeah. Well, there's a number of threads going on in figuring out how to put these books together, right? Because you just have the basic chronology of time. So we're going to march through time, and we're very careful about that, right? Each chapter takes place after the last chapter. So we got to cover what happened over time. There's institutional history. We want to show how the church has changed over time. And so that's one of the criteria of choosing a story. There are so many just wonderful, fascinating stories that we could tell. But fundamentally, we need stories that show something about how the church has changed over time. So for example, in Saints Volume 3, we spend quite a lot of time with the Bang family in Cincinnati. And that enables us to show what it was like to be a member of the church outside of the Mormon heartland in the Intermountain West, and shows kind of the development of buildings and ward and stake missions and access to things like patriarchal blessings. And so those stories are chosen so that they can show something about how the church changed over time. I wouldn't say that we choose stories solely on the basis of, this is faith promoting. Mm-hmm. But obviously what we're trying to show is people's experience of faith. People's experience with the Spirit and with the meaning of the gospel in their lives, because that's what Saints is. I mean, that's who we are as Latter-day Saints. And ultimately, I think that's more faith promoting, to let people's stories speak for themselves, than if you have a narrator who has to stop every so often and say, this is really faith promoting, take note here, right? So those those are kind of the main criteria. Now, in terms of meeting our demands for everything being based on sources, then obviously we have to have source material to work with in the stories. There's a lot of stories that we'll find, referred to in a book or an oral history where you're like, oh, that's a really cool story, but you don't have enough to go on. Ideally, we have firsthand material from the participants themselves.
Like a journal entry
Journals,
or
letters.
Okay.
Oral histories. In this book, we're able to rely on quite a number of oral history interviews. Obviously, we don't have that for like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. That's not a type of source that we had for the earlier volumes. But here, we were able to do some interviews with people.
So when you have one story that you're looking at from a particular source, are you typically looking for corroboration of that story from another source in order to bring it in?
If there's an element of it that could be in question,
okay,
like did it happen this way or that way? And sometimes you'll find that in the sources, maybe the mission president's oral history tells a story one way and someone's journal tells a story another way. And so that's where the historical craft comes in, of kind of weighing sources against each other. And of course, you prefer a firsthand contemporary source. So if it's in a diary as opposed to an oral history 30 years later,
right,
then, that can make a difference in how we tell the story.
Okay. So yeah. So I appreciated that there are some challenging subjects in these few decades. There are some things that I wasn't necessarily very familiar with. So I want to hear your perspective as a historian about why it's important to know, as Latter-day Saints, to know the history that is uncomfortable, like that might actually really be challenging to our faith. Maybe one example is the whole era around the end of plural marriage. This is something that I think can be really challenging to someone's faith, because the story that feels beautiful and sanitized is that this revelation was received and thank goodness the practice is over and we all moved on. And so it can be challenging to discover that, Joseph F. Smith was actually subpoenaed by the government and really pressured to put an actual end to plural marriage. And the revelation was received the next day. Like that can be like, that can really, challenge how you think of revelation, which is probably a picture of more like, something quiet that happens in the temple after contemplation. And it's like very peaceful and has nothing to do with, with politics. So, and there were a few examples of that where revelation seems to be very attached to some practical problem that is banging at the door of the first presidency. So, so talk about just, why is it important really as Latter-day Saints now to understand our history when it could actually really be threatening or challenging to our faith, maybe?
Well, the first thing I would say there is, what is it threatening or challenging to? Because what you're describing is that it's threatening or challenging to our assumptions. And if our faith, so to speak, is based on unpacked assumptions, then it needs to be challenged. Then we need to go through that process of unpacking what we think we know and how do we think we know that, right? I mean, if you go back to the Doctrine and Covenants, those revelations mostly are received in answer to questions that are knocking on the first presidency's door, right? It is very much about practical day-to-day considerations of what do we do and how do we do it. So in that sense, it shouldn't be a surprise to us that that's how revelation works, that it comes in response to questions and needs and within the context of even like what questions people can think to ask at any given time, or, what seems important in a historical moment. So, I mean, one reason that it's important for this history to be out there then is because this is what happened. Like, we need to know what happened. And simplified narratives of history have their place. and that tends to be how we learn history as children, and how we can use history to teach like simplified morality lessons or whatever. But the truth is that human experience is and always has been messy. And that's true for prophets, and it's true for average Latter-day Saints as well. And so in that sense, I think the books are extremely helpful and, quote, faith promoting in showing the way that church leaders, prophets, have wrestled with questions, have wrestled with problems, the way that revelation comes in a context, in the middle of a messy world. And it's not just like pick up a phone and talk to God every day and he tells you what to do.
Yeah.
Right. And I think too often that's our unexamined assumption about how it works.
Yeah.
And that's the dissonance that you feel is like what you assumed is absolutely not reality. And I really love that. That's a great paradigm. Like, that's okay to break that down.
Yeah. And which isn't to say that, some of the narratives that we've inherited are not complete, are kind of sanitized. Partly that can be a function of just people don't know or remember. I mean, you see how much there is here. Like from generation to generation, people just don't remember everything or know everything or have the full context. Partly it's like I was saying before about a sensibility about what history is and what history should do. And, we got to be careful with which stories we tell and how we tell them. So changing sensibilities about that, I think, affect the way that these stories are told.
Okay, we've asked this question on this podcast before, but I'm super curious your take on it. And this is just sort of a broader context question. Do you believe that we should be careful about the things that we read or careful about learning? Like, can learning ever be dangerous? Can sources ever be things to be avoided? And the reason I ask, obviously, is, I mean, we've been told personally, like, oh, don't read that, like that.
Be careful.
Be careful about that. Like that could mess with your faith or whatever. I have never. I guess my path that I've taken over the last 10 to 15 years has been to read the things, and my faith has absolutely been challenged, but I'm really grateful that that I've gone through that challenge. I think my faith is deeper in a lot of ways, but I'm kind of giving you my answer. I'm curious what you think, in terms of learning and the possibility for danger in learning.
I think a lot of it does go back to that question of unexamined assumptions. Rick Turley, who we talked about earlier, he always says, don't study church history too little. Mm-hmm. And that can be what happens, right, is someone reads a couple of things. Oh, well, I know too much now.
Right.
No, you don't know enough. We can't ever know enough. Like, we can never fully reconstruct and totally understand everything. So I don't find facts, I don't find that to be threatening. Mm. And just to read somebody's diary or someone's minutes or accounts of things that happened the way they happened, that's just what happened. I mean, that's just the way it is. The question is, what assumptions are you bringing to bear on it? What framework are you interpreting those through? I think some sources are not helpful when they are antagonistic, when they're framed to be sensational, when they're framed as, well, I'm telling you the truth and no one else is, right. That kind of stuff. It's not usually the facts, it's the interpretation that's the problem. And yes, I mean, the church has a perspective and is going to present its story from a faithful, affirming perspective, as it should. That doesn't mean that it's not, that story's not based on careful scholarship. There's room for a lot of interpretation on various issues, and I think people have to know the difference between when they're reading factual material and when they're reading interpretive material, and then when they're reading polarizing, antagonistic, when they're reading that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I feel like, though, there was definitely a time where I felt like, okay, I'm going to read more until I get to the beautiful truth. Like, I'm just going to keep going until it all makes sense. And I think that can be a dangerous paradigm too, that like, just keep reading. And I think when you're in a relationship that feels threatened by your, like, seeking after new understanding, I think what you might hear often is like, if you learn more, then you'll realize like everything's okay. Like, you're eventually going to get to this perfect story where there was nothing wrong. So that's not what you're saying, really. Like, I mean, what do you do when like you keep going and like it's just raw and ugly?
Yeah. Or on the other side, the people that will tell you, just keep going and you'll get to a point where you really see the truth and you know too much to believe in all that nonsense anymore.
Absolutely,
right? I mean, like, it doesn't matter how many times you Google Joseph Smith and polygamy. Like, you're only ever going to find a limited amount of information about that. Everything you find, every interpretation, everything anybody says about it is based on the same few sources.
Yeah.
And so, you can't Google your way to faith. You can't Google your way to sense.
That's very quotable.
That's that's going on our social media.
You can't Google your way to certainty. You can't Google your way to peace.
Yeah.
I mean, I can speak personally. Like, for me, faith is about my relationship with God. It's about, do I have the Spirit in my life? It's about, am I growing and learning and progressing spiritually? And I think history shows beautiful examples of that. It shows people's experience with God and with the Spirit. It shows people's conversion. It shows the faith and the sacrifices. But, history doesn't compel us one way or another. History is history. History is what happened. Ultimately, questions of faith are me and the Lord on my knees in the closet. And people don't want to hear that when they're encountering things that feel like it's, sending their world reeling. Like, when they're in a place of real discomfort, I really understand that. But it's still kind of true.
Yeah.
That just kind of still is where it has to come down to.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
Thanks
you
for diving into that with us.
Yeah.
To get back to Saints a little bit, I'm curious. Obviously, this is a work that has importance within the church, far beyond just the church history department, right? I can imagine that, the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12, they have their eyes on this and they care about this effort. Mm-hmm. And when we think about like documents with that type of visibility, obviously in the church, they've typically, or at least for, several decades, have gone through a correlation process, right? Mm-hmm. Preach My Gospel or teaching manuals or whatever. Right. So to what extent does a document like this go through the correlation process? And on the other side, to what extent are historians like yourself and the writers able to sort of, exercise their full scholarly skills? Yeah,
that's a good question. That's a legitimate question. Well, okay. So the process on producing Saints, as I've kind of explained, is historians doing historical research, as well as like outlining the book. As a general editor on these books, that's been my primary role in helping to outline and identify the stories that we tell, the issues that we address, the changes that we want to be sure and cover. And that's a, multi-layered, multi-step process. We go back and forth. The chapters are drafted. Editors like me, we review them, usually multiple times. Changes are made. When we have a text that we're happy with, then it goes what we call upline.
Okay.
And so that's through the executives in our department. So the managing director of the church history department, and then the executive director, which is Elder Curtis right now. Elder LeGrand Curtis is the church historian, and the executive director, Elder Kyle McKay, is the deputy director. So they'll read it, give us feedback, incorporate the feedback, I should mention as well that by the time it gets to that point, we've had outside experts read it. So if we have
outside of the church, or
yeah,
outside of
the department,
okay.
Sometimes outside of the church. I mean, it doesn't have to be Latter-day Saint scholars, though we have a pretty rich body of scholars to draw on.
Sure.
But so like, all the scenes about World War II, there's a lot of really detailed information in there about the war, about the countries, about the church and the way things worked. So we'll have someone who's kind of an expert on that read those scenes and let us know if we've got it right, So by the time the chapters go for formal approval, they have been scrutinized many, many times. And so from our executives, then they go to our advisors in the 12, at which we have 2 advisors from the 12, and then from there they go to the First Presidency. So So Saints is an official church production. It is reviewed and approved all the way up to the First Presidency. Correlation is definitely part of that process, and we work back and forth with them on concerns that they might have and on concerns historians have about this is the history. We're not going to compromise on what actually happened and on the facts of the story. So Saints is an official church publication in the same way as those other things that you mentioned. It's not like a BYU publication or an independent publication. It has the stamp of the church on it. So that's why it goes through such an extensive review process.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So I think the thing that was the coolest about this whole volume is just that it feels like the pioneer church meets the modern church, like I was saying, and I loved every time a name that felt like a pioneer name was mingling with someone who feels modern to me. I love that, like, Joseph F. Smith dies something like 8 years before Neil A. Maxwell's born. Like, it's just the converging of 2 worlds, and it was so cool. The entire book is just this just like interesting narrative of pioneers talking with people who I consider, part of my world. It was just so interesting. So I want to spend a lot of time just talking about some of the ways that the institutional church changes, because it's so radical. There's so many huge changes, and I have a few of my favorites, but I'd love to hear for you, what were some of the most interesting changes that happened in these decades, about 5?
Yeah. I often tell people, like, if you walked into, say, a fast and testimony meeting in the early 1890s, which I can't remember the exact year, but they were held on Thursdays up until into the 1890s.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Fast and testimony meetings specifically, really?
Well, we figured that one out.
Every Thursday?
Yep, on Thursdays. I don't know if it's every Thursday, but when Fast Day was Thursday.
Okay.
And then when people started, having jobs instead of working on their own farms and living in the cities and so forth, then it kind of shifts over. But if you walk into a meeting like that in the early, 1890s, it's going to look really different and feel really different. I mean, first of all, it's probably adult men blessing and passing the sacrament. They might kneel or lift their arms up. I mean, there's just different ways that they did it. And then if you walk into a church meeting in 1955, you're going to know where you're at.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to look pretty familiar. There'll be some differences, but it's going to look familiar. So yeah, that transformation is incredible. That happens, and as we show in the book, it kind of takes place over time. One of the most consequential, what would you say, landmarks in the process is what we call the Priesthood Reform movement of Joseph F. Smith, that Joseph F. Smith kind of launches in the first decade of the 20th century. And what's happened is that what they called the auxiliaries at that time, the Sunday school, the Relief Society, the young women, the primary, the young men, they are big and they're very vibrant, and they have their own extensive organizations. And for a lot of people, like, that's your primary interface with the church. So you might go to Sunday school on Sunday morning, but you might not go to sacrament meeting.
Really?
Especially if you're a woman who's staying home to cook dinner and take care of children, wow. Right? And so, if you're a young person, maybe you go to Mutual on Tuesday nights and maybe not as much on Sundays. I mean, just depending on your circumstances, like the markers of what constituted being active in the church changed over time. And in fact, the term active and inactive kind of comes into use in the 30s.
Really?
Yeah. So President Smith is looking around and he's seeing this, and he feels like there needs to be some reform and some strengthening of the priesthood quorums and the priesthood lines of authority in the church as what he calls the central governing power of the church, and that the auxiliaries need to be brought into kind of a subordinate position with the priesthood lines. And then part of that is also wanting to see more participation of men and young men in priesthood and in their quorums. So, I mean, again, like we could talk about this for a long time. Bill Hartley wrote some really great articles kind of tracing this that we don't have time to get into detail on. But this is the era when, for example, they start ordaining and advancing young men through Aaronic priesthood offices in the way that we think about it now. The ages were a little different than what we do now, but the ages we do now are a little different than they were a few years ago.
Exactly,
so that changes the priesthood quorums that had been organized on the stake level become organized on the ward level, and men's participation in the priesthood is really emphasized and seen as an important marker of participation in the church. Now, part of that leads to, as well, an impulse to define and standardize and codify priesthood procedures. And so you start to get things like handbooks, manuals of instruction. You get, for the first time, instructions written down for how do you administer to the sick, how do you do an ordinance, in the ways that we would recognize now. And so that takes place over really the teens, the 20s. Grant continues it in his administration into the 30s and 40s. And it's like a mind frame that takes hold. Mm-hmm. So in the pioneer church, how do you learn how to give a blessing or perform an ordinance? You watch someone else and they tell you how to do it. But in a more modern way of thinking, there's got to be a rule book, there's got to be a manual, there's got to be instructions written down. And so that's a really far-reaching change that's both reflecting a change in mindset and creating a change in mindset. And eventually you get things like membership records and, all the extensive reporting and roles and statistical things that we just kind of take for granted now.
Yeah.
So that's one really, really important change that took place that like nobody really knows about.
Yeah.
That's not familiar to most of us. You just don't think about it.
Yeah.
And that just kind of created the air that we breathe.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That we just don't think to question, well, where did that come from? You mean they didn't always do it that way? No, they didn't. Yeah.
So can I ask you, you may have some more, but while we're on this, I know another, one of the other huge changes is this shift in how we seal families to each other as opposed to sealing to other apostles or however you picked. And so, but if this was before records, I was curious after I read that section, like what happened to all of those sealings? So if you were sealed to an apostle and then they have this change where you're allowed now to be sealed to someone who wasn't necessarily a priesthood holder.
Yeah.
Were those sealings ever rectified? Like, did they change the pioneer sealings, or were there even records kept of who was sealed to?
There were definitely records kept, and I'm not an expert on this, so I can't tell you exactly what happened or what happened in every case. But what you're getting at, there's a larger story here, which is the rise of what's been called temple consciousness among Latter-day Saints. Which, if you think about it, up until 1877, there's not a temple in Utah. You have the endowment house, but up until up until that point, like temple, the opportunity to participate in the temple is pretty limited. And then in the 80s, they managed to build the Logan Temple, the Manti Temple, and then we get the Salt Lake Temple. And this revelation that Wilford Woodruff has in 1894, shifting our understanding of who should be sealed to whom and thinking of it more in terms of family lines, then opens up a lot of opportunity for people to participate in the temple in ways that hadn't necessarily existed before. Like if you go to the endowment house in the 1860s and you get your endowment and you're married, like that might be the only time you go to the temple. The big thing is that once you have this revelation from President Woodruff and then the formation of the Genealogical Society, which we talk a little bit about in the book, then it just opens up this enormous world of possibilities for temple work. And it starts to become a more regular, expected part of Latter-day Saints worship practices and religious engagement in a way that it hadn't necessarily been before. And our friend Susie Young Gates, who is featured in the book, was really a driving force in that. She spent the last 3 decades of her life teaching people and promoting what they called genealogy at the time, and writing lessons and going around the church and giving lectures and just really trying to get people interested, because she felt that this was so important. It's the redemption of the dead. You know, this is why her experience with Joseph F. Smith and his vision in 1918 is so powerful, is because she's been wearing out her life trying to get people to do this. And this revelation that comes to him is a real confirmation of the importance of that. So those of us who have like pioneer ancestry and say, oh, our work's all been done, or, you know, grandma, so whoever did it, a lot of that work dates back to this early 20th century period when there's this real surge of interest and effort in genealogy.
I loved her story. And there were a lot like that where people just recognized a need and they had a passion and just started doing stuff. And then, you know, and then eventually it kind of became part of what we know, you know, in the church now. But like, it just felt like there was a lot of that exact thing. Like Susa just like having this burning passion and finding a way to make it happen. And then eventually it gets some traction. But I want to ask you a specific question about her story, sort of. You know, I felt like when I was reading about this drive to be connected in this new way and understand who our ancestors are and connect to them and to each other, I wondered how that affects your perspective about sealings now, because I think this is a pain point for some specific people. Like I'm thinking of women who, you know, have been sealed to a husband and then there's a death, and like this is really painful for them. And so I wonder, just with a bigger, I think you have such a broad perspective about how this all came together. You know, what do you say to someone who's really in pain about the technicalities of sealings right now?
I think there's a key in an understanding that grows out of President Woodruff's revelation, which is that we do the best we can in this life, and that there's a lot of things that will be sorted out in the life to come. He said he thought most people would accept the gospel, and so that's why we do work for everyone and seal to everyone. Before that, they hadn't been too sure. Like if my grandfather rejected the gospel, I can't be sealed to him because he wasn't faithful, right? So I can't trust him as a link in the chain. And President Woodruff is saying, well, we can't really make those judgments. And so, yeah, there are a lot of aspects of sealing and sealing practices and policies that still raise questions that can be really painful and really difficult. And I understand why it's not always a satisfactory answer, but I do think that what President Woodruff gave us opens up space for understanding that there will be resolution, things will be sorted out on the other side, even if we don't know how right now.
Yeah, and I like, even when he received the revelation, I liked the way it was worded, that isn't he the one who said, in fact, I can probably find the quote where he says like that he knows that he Oh, this is it actually. Can I just read this?
That was amazing.
That was a sign.
Yeah,
Just open right out to it.
Right to the page.
President Woodruff then returned to, okay, so is this general conference that he gives this revelation? Okay,
Yeah,
he says,
it's April.
He says, we have not got through Revelation, he declared. We have not got through the work of God. He spoke of how Brigham Young had carried on Joseph's work, building temples and organizing temple ordinances. And then he says, but Joseph, speaking of Joseph, he did not receive all the revelations that belonged to this work. President Woodruff reminded the congregation, neither did President Taylor nor has Wilford Woodruff. There will be no end to this work until it is perfected. I never heard that before. And I love that, like, he was opening this up, you know, they were moving forward and doing something a little different, but even in this certainty of revelation, he expressed this real humility that this is not the end. Like, I know that this isn't the end of revelation for this, even this particular thing, which is as right as I can get it right now, you know?
Yeah.
So that gives me hope.
It does. I think it's one of the ways that these stories are very faith inspiring, in the idea of, in the fact of continuing revelation, and the fact that things come a little at a time, line upon line, that they come according to what's needed at the time and the questions and circumstances of the time.
Yeah.
You know, President Nelson's still saying it today in terms of the ongoing restoration, that the restoration is still happening, right? It's pretty much exactly the same thing that President Woodruff was saying. Yeah. And like, who would know better than they would, right? That's what's happening, because they're experiencing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One other really interesting thing I wanted to ask you about, it's very clear even from the opening pages of the book that the church was in a very different financial situation than the one we're used to being in now.
Yeah.
Is there any chance you could just sort of paint a picture of what the conditions were financially for the church, you know, starting in 1893, and sort of how the crisis eventually was resolved?
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on the financial history of the church, and so like I can't crunch numbers or anything like that. But in a big picture sense, basically the anti-polygamy crusade had decimated the church's financial standing, partly because people couldn't and didn't pay tithing. You know, I mean, just the established channels for revenues for the church really diminished as people are in hiding, and then the government is seizing the church's assets. So why would you pay tithing if it's going to be seized by the government, right? There's a terrible, terrible depression in the economy in the 1890s. Like, it was the worst depression until the Great Depression. And so it was a decade of real difficulty financially for everybody. And that, of course, is reflected in the church's standing as well. So it's really, once those things kind of subside, so the polygamy stuff is more or less settled, at least in terms of legal and the church's property and so forth, and the depression starts to ease up a little bit, then we show in the book the story of President Snow feeling inspired to start teaching the importance of paying tithing.
Yes.
And that did represent kind of a turning point and made a big difference in the church's financial picture.
That was a really interesting story that he, you know, despite I think it says that he was 85 at that time when he sort of embarked on that Southern Utah tour, you know, and was preaching tithing along the way. I was wondering though, is that the same story that has some like mythology attached to it in previous versions of church history? Because like he went to St. George, I can't remember exactly how the myth goes, but
there was a storm. I know there was some rain.
It was a drought and there was a storm and the tithing fixed it. Like no mention of that in Saints, but that's the same
Which
incident,
means
right?
that we could not corroborate that from a primary source.
That's what I was wondering.
I think at least people my age might remember a film called The Windows of Heaven.
That's right, the film. I've seen the film. Yes.
When we were kids, and how they start paying their tithing and it causes it to rain, and that ends the drought. And I can't speak to the absolute factuality of that or not.
Didn't make it into the book.
Why is not in the book? Yeah.
It didn't make it into the book.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, along with a couple of other things with President Snow that we could talk about. Yeah.
I know we kind of need to wrap up, but I feel like we kind of talked about priesthood. I want to talk about women and how this era really changed for the women in the church.
Well,
pick one.
How long have we got?
Yeah,
because wow, we could talk about that for a long time. This era is an era of really vibrant women's organizations within the church. So President Smith's, priesthood reform movement notwithstanding, the women's organizations and the auxiliaries in general, but most of those are women's organizations, Primary Young Women, Relief Society, they are big. They have their own leadership structures. They're very well organized. They're doing a lot of work, both spiritual work, teaching within the church, as well as just work in the communities. We show the Relief Society and their social services and their maternal and child health campaign that they launch. We have the great story of Evelyn Hodges, the social worker who's working for the Relief Society during the Depression. I mean, it's an era where the women's organizations are very big and very vibrant. They're also subject to the same impulses towards modernizing that the rest of the church is. So things become more standardized, more centralized. We saw this as we were researching the history of the Young Women organization. We really saw this change around the turn of the century, where before they talk about the young ladies associations in the plural, because like every ward has one and they're all kind of their own thing. And then around the turn of the century, it's the Young Ladies Mutual Improvement Association. And it's a centralized organization. There's a board. They send out manuals and calendars of like, this is what you do on every week of the year. And everybody in the church is doing the same thing on the same day every year. So those things are happening in the auxiliaries and the women's organizations at the same time that they're happening in the church at large. I know one of the changes, one of the transitions that happens during this period that people are often interested in is the shift from women laying on hands to bless or heal, to that practice fading. And the story there is quite complicated. It's not easy to document some aspects of it. But we do have, I should mention that along with the books, we have a lot of other material in the Saints Project, under the heading of the Saints Project, that people should be aware of. And one of those things is a collection of what we call church history topics articles.
Really?
And this is all available on your Gospel Library app in the church history section. We have videos and we have the church history topics. And we do have an article about healing in the church history topics that traces some of that. So we're writing the book. We've talked about the style that the book is written in, and it's this narrative style. We can't just stop and say, oh, hey, by the way, let us explain the history of healing to you.
Right.
So we've, stripped that out and written these articles about it. So
because it was less of it was kind of like a cultural shift, right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, there's no question. Okay, there's, again, threads that are coming together in this story. And one of these threads is definitely this priesthood reform movement and the emphasis on healing as a priesthood ordinance. And that comes to be preferred. So in 1914, for example, you have the first presidency writing a circular letter saying, well, anyone who has faith can lay on hands to the sick and bless the sick in the name of Christ. That's the privilege of every believer. But it's preferable, and I can't remember, they may not have exactly used the word preferable, but the way that they express it is, it's better to call in the elders, because that's what the Lord has said to do. And so that for 20 years or so becomes kind of what you hear a lot is, well, we know that it's been done. And especially when it came to this practice of what they called washing and anointing for childbirth, where women would bless each other before giving birth. And you can understand that's kind of an intimate female thing, and why that was felt to be more appropriate for women to engage in. So that kind of holds on a little bit longer. But so there's kind of like, well, we know that it's been done before. And there's also awareness that Joseph Smith, in his teachings to the Nauvoo Relief Society, had endorsed female healing, had said there's no sin in it. That women should be able to do this. And so I think there's a reluctance to ever say, no, can't happen, right? And so that's why there isn't, I think, ever like a definitive document or statement that you can point to that says women cannot do this. But at the same time, so that's one thread. You can tell this authoritative story about priesthood and what the authorities of the church are saying and so forth. At the same time, if you think about the shifts in society that take place from the turn of the century to, say, 1940, in medical care, in the setting for medical care, in how childbirth, for example, is experienced and happens for women, and sensibilities about the body and medicine, and just there's a whole constellation of things that's shifting during this period. And I have tried, it's difficult to document this directly, but if you spend time in the sources, what you see is shifting sensibilities to where, like, I think there comes a point where women like Amy Brown Lyman and younger women who she's working with in the Relief Society are looking back at these other practices and going, that's weird. That's old fashioned. That's what grandma did. And at a time when we are very self-conscious about being modern, being progressive, right? There's this sense that, well, the way things were in the past isn't necessarily what we're comfortable with now. And in general, in the church, you have the decline of what we call the charismatic practices, speaking in tongues, that kind of stuff.
Where there was never a specific statement about that either, right? This was another one of those things that sort of just like fell out of fashion.
And and to the extent that there's statements about it, it's that gifts of the Spirit need to be exercised through the priesthood, that the gift of tongues is for missionary work and, for helping people to be more effective as missionaries, which, to be fair, Joseph Smith said too. But, that mindset is taking hold. Yeah. With healing as well, again, a lot going on, but the temple had been a site for healing in the 19th and early 20th century. So you could go and be baptized for your health. You could go and be administered to in the temple for your health by a man or a woman. There were women who were set apart to heal within the temple. That's discontinued in the early 1920s. And so that takes away like an authorized place for women to heal at the same time that the message is, it's a priesthood ordinance, it's a priesthood ordinance. And it's to be done in this particular way. So that's the other thing people don't realize is that if you talk about, the gift of healing and the way people are administering to the sick back in the 1850s, 1870s, whatever, it's not put a drop of oil on their forehead and put your hands on their head the way that we do it now. That's one of the things that gets defined in this priesthood reform movement. Up until the early 20th century, like they're going to administer to whatever body part is having problems. Really? They're going to rub oil into it. They're going to use the oil in different ways. They might drink it. I mean, there's just a lot of variation in the healing practices as well. And so as everything gets more defined, that's kind of the process. Wow. Again, like how long have you got? It's such an interesting story. This is just
not even the tip of the iceberg. There's so many interesting things. But I like that. I mean, that's a good example of what you hear in the book over and over and over again. Just like ways that something became formalized and became what we know today.
Yeah.
Can I ask one? Okay. Can I ask one more thing?
Yeah.
I'm curious. So there's this really interesting part of the book where it talks about the Reed-Smoot hearings, where essentially the U.S. Senate was trying to determine if Reed-Smoot would be allowed to serve as a U.S. Senator based on if he would be truly objective in his decision-making, right? And independent from the church. And so Joseph F. Smith was being interviewed, interrogated, and they're sort of diving in on revelation. And like, if you received a revelation, would that be binding on Reed Smoot or any other member of the church? And there's this quote where he says that he had never received a revelation other than, I'm going to paraphrase here, but other than to know that Mormonism is true or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it kind of reminded me, who wrote Pioneer Prophet, Brigham Young's biography? John Turner. Thank you. He brings up a quote from Brigham Young early in his tenure as president of the church, where he says, "I never claimed to be a prophet like Joseph Smith, but I am a Yankee guesser," which is
my favorite Brigham Young quote.
That's a great one.
The phrase Yankee guesser. But so I'm curious. Obviously, we have this very clear definition now of the president of the church is a prophet, very much like Joseph Smith was. Mm-hmm. At what point in history did this, evolve to how we understand it now? And did that transition happen during this period?
Yeah. I think you could find all along through church history, you can find people, members of the church, leaders of the church, talking about prophets, the leaders of the church being prophets. As far as the expression, the prophet, if we just refer to the prophet, probably up till the middle of the 20th century, if you said that, people thought you meant Joseph Smith.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Really?
And it's really been a development in the last 50, 60 years or so, where this idea of the prophet, seers, and revelators for the church, the emphasis on that role for the leaders of the church, the way we think about it now, has rhetorically become so common. So that's not to say that concept wasn't always there, but maybe just not spoken about or emphasized in the same way that it has come to be. And I think the shift really starts to happen in this period, but you'll see it more in volume 4.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
it's
great.
really a product. It's really a product of correlation.
Really?
Yeah.
And do you feel like that can be said about a lot of these changes? Do you think it was the fact that they needed to write this down and send it to Europe or send it to Brazil that kind of forced these big evolutions?
One of the things that this book shows is how the church had to adapt internationally, how they start to have an awareness that what's happening in Utah, where, Latter-day Saints live, isn't going to work in Germany or, Latin America or whatever. So there starts to be a real dawning of that awareness. By the early 1930s, we show that with all the work that the Widsows do, especially Leah Widsow does, to get things translated into German and whatever. And then the war happens, and it just kind of decimates the efforts that had been underway and just kind of knocks everybody back a few steps. And so it'll be after the war and really in volume 4 where we start to see this explosive international growth and what the implications of that are for how the church has to adapt to places.
Well, that brings us to Saints volume 4. I guess this is a good place to draw the line, even though we didn't get to any, there were so many interesting things. I wanted to talk about Word of Wisdom. You'll have to read the book. Zion, this whole concept of Zion, people kind of stop moving to Utah. All of this happens in these decades. Is there anything else big that you wanted to talk about that we've? I know it's hard to choose your favorite.
I want to talk about all of it.
Yeah.
I want to point people to the story of Helga Meyer. She's one of the backbone characters of the book, and her story is just so beautiful and so fascinating in the way that it intersects with so many points in the church, in change over time in the church. And just the personal things that she experiences are so powerful. I love the way that the book comes together at the end with the dedication of the Swiss temple. And I didn't mention this when we talked about the project as an overview, but the way that that these volumes are envisioned is that each volume leads to a landmark that has something to do with the temple.
Really?
So if you think about volume 1, it ends with the saints being endowed in the Nauvoo temple. And then volume 2 ends with the dedication of the Salt Lake temple. Volume 3 with the Swiss temple, which really is, as they say, a new era. It's like a new way of taking the temple to the people, and is implicated in this shift from gather to Zion, gather to Utah, to establish Zion where you're at. And part of that will be having temples there so that people don't have to leave their homelands in order to get the blessings of the temple. And then volume 4 will take us to the point where we have temples all over the world. And so that's a thread to watch for as you're reading the book, is the longing for, the need for, the desire for, the complications with having the temple available.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's such a timely release of this book, because, you know, it covers 2 world wars and a pandemic, and you're hearing it from the perspective of saints. It was just so interesting over and over to read how relevant their ideas and thoughts and worries and wrestles were, because we're kind of living in parallel times in some ways. So,
and we were drafting those chapters on the pandemic in early 2020, right as everything was falling apart.
Wow.
Yeah,
that was
so it was so interesting to us how much that came together.
I bet.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
And thanks to the entire team. We can't name everybody that was involved, but what a huge monumental effort by everybody.
Thank you.
We're really grateful. All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Lisa Olsen Tait. A huge thanks to Lisa for coming on. Again, this volume of Saints is available now on the church's website and through the Gospel Library app. And as always, if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. It definitely helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we really appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and remember to check out more at faithmatters.org.